Hey guys, it's Mrs. Jones. I just wanted to explain a little bit about what we're going to be doing for this activity. You have with you the packet occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, so you'll want to take that out now if you don't already have that out. And what I'm going to do for the first couple pages is just sort of model for you what it looks like to be an active, engaged reader. So first quarter we talked a lot about annotations, and you have a big list of those in a chart. Predictions, asking questions, making connections, things like that you write on the text as you're reading to kind of show your thought process as you're reading. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of walk you through this, how I would do it for the first couple pages. I'd like you to jot down the thoughts that I share with you to show that you watched this video. And then I would like you to finish the text on your own tonight and annotate it at least twice per page and bring it to class tomorrow to turn it in for a grade. Remember, annotations are unique and insightful, and no two people should have the same annotations, so make sure that these are your own annotations and that you don't work with or share with a friend. Okay, so a little bit of background information. First finding his voice in newspapers, Bierce became a prolific author of short stories, often humorous and sometimes bitter or macabre. He spoke out against oppression and supported civil and religious freedoms. He also wrote numerous Civil War stories from first-hand experience. Many of his works are ranked among other esteemed American authors like Edgar Allan Poe, Stephen Crane, and Mark Twain. Bierce's life was not without its own tragedies. He was divorced, 2 of his children died, and he disappeared. So the first thing that I'm going to stop and take note of here is in this paragraph, and you should jot this down just in the margins somewhere. It talked about some of his writing being bitter, and it also talked about how he had tragedies in his own life and how he was connected with the Civil War. So all of those things to me seem connected. Okay, the next paragraph. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, Bierce enlisted in the 9th Indiana Infantry, either by the call of his military ancestors or boredom. After a distinguished period of service, he resigned in 1865 after a bullet wound to the head continued to plague him with dizziness and blackouts. The experience gave him much to write about, and his future stories based on the Civil War. Just a personal note here, after he got a bullet wound to the head, that just seems kind of crazy. So I would just jot down like, what? How did that influence his life and impact him? Okay. The third paragraph says, an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge is one of the most widely anthologized American short stories and is considered Ambrose Bierce's best work of short fiction. First published in Bierce's short story collection, Tale of Soldiers and Civilians, in 1891, the story centers on Peyton Farquhar, a Southern planter who, while not a Confederate soldier, is about to be hanged by the Union Army for attempting to destroy the railroad bridge at Owl Creek. Okay, so here I see that this is a story about a Southern planter who's being hanged by the Union Army. And what I'm going to do is just make a quick connection here to our author who had his own experiences in the war. So in the margin here, and I don't have a margin as easily as you guys do, but I would just jot down, it looks like Bierce's personal experiences with war influenced this story. So that's just one annotation I would make there. Okay, I'll put my annotations in color for you to make them a little bit more clear. Alrighty. An occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge by Ambrose Bierce. A man stood upon a railroad bridge in northern Alabama, looking down into the swift water 20 feet below. The man's hands were behind his back, the wrists bound with a cord. A rope closely encircled his neck. It was attached to a stout cross timber above his head, and the slack fell to the level of his knees. Some loose boards laid upon the ties supporting the rails of the railway supplied a footing for him and his executioners. 2 private soldiers of the Federal Army directed by a sergeant who in civil life may have been a deputy sheriff. At a short remove, upon the same temporary platform, was an officer in the uniform of his rank, armed. He was a captain. A sentinel at each end of the bridge, stood with his rifle in position known as support, that is to say, vertical in front of the left shoulder, the hammer resting on the forearm, thrown straight across the chest, a formal and unnatural position, enforcing an erect carriage of the body. It didn't appear to be the duty of these two men to know what was occurring at the center of the bridge. They merely blockaded the two ends of the foot planking that traversed it. So if I was to stop and check understanding here, it sounds like, obviously, it's a really vivid description of a man standing on a bridge, flanked by some soldiers, and he's about to be hung. I would, if I were you, go ahead and highlight that the people against him were soldiers of the Federal Army, just so I can keep track of sides here. Okay. Beyond one of the sentinels, nobody was in sight. The railroad ran straight away into a forest for 100 yards, then, curving, was lost to view. Doubtless there was an outpost farther along. The other bank of the stream was open ground, a gentle slope topped with a stockade of vertical tree trunks, loopholed for rifles, with a single embrasure through which protruded the muzzle of a brass cannon commanding the bridge. Midway up the slope between the bridge and fort were the spectators, a single company of infantry in line at parade rest, the butts of their rifles on the ground, the barrels inclining slightly backward against the right shoulder, the hands crossed upon the stock. A lieutenant stood at the right of the line, the point of his sword upon the ground, his left hand resting upon his right. Excepting the group of four at the center of the bridge, not a man moved. The company faced the bridge, staring stonily, motionless. The sentinels facing the banks of the stream might have been statues to adorn the bridge. The captain stood with folded arms, silent, observing the work of his subordinates, but making no sign. Death is a dignitary, who when he comes announced is to be received with formal manifestations of respect, even by those most familiar with him. In the code of military etiquette, silence and fixity are forms of deference. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to note that we have a metaphor here. And I'm going to try and interpret what it means. Death is a dignitary. So if I'm not sure what the word dignitary means, I could use my glossary. It is notable, a VIP, important person, a celebrity, worthy, or a public figure. Okay, so death is a notable person or being. And when he comes around, when death comes around unannounced, he is to be received with formal manifestations of respect. So what I take that to mean is that even though these men are obviously on the opposite side of the war and have captured this man and they're hanging him, it would seem that they're being really respectful. So I'm just going to jot that down, and you should too. Are being respectful as they take the man's life. Even though they're obviously hanging him, they're doing it in a respectful way. They're not taking it lightly, they're taking it seriously and reverently. Okay. The man who was engaged in being hanged was apparently about 35 years of age. He was a civilian, if one might judge from his habit, which was that of a planter. Okay, that's a lot of characterization there, so I am going to highlight that. Because if he's 35, we know he's young, and he's a citizen, he's a civilian, and he's probably a planter. So what that tells me is that he is not a soldier, which they did tell us earlier, but I'm just remembering that. Okay. So they are hanging a civilian of 36 years of age. His features were good, a straight nose, firm mouth, broad forehead, from which his long dark hair was combed straight back, falling behind his ears to the collar of his well-fitting frock coat. He wore a mustache and pointed beard, but no whiskers, His eyes were large and dark gray and had a kindly expression which one would hardly have expected in one whose neck was in the hem. Evidently this was no vulgar assassin. The liberal military code makes provisions for hanging many kinds of persons, and gentlemen are not excluded. So it says he's well dressed, his hair is well kept, and it says you wouldn't expect this kind of person to be hanged, and he doesn't seem vulgar or like a violent person. It says the liberal military code makes provision for hanging many kinds of people, and gentlemen are not excluded. Okay, this is making me question, why is this man being hanged if he's a gentleman? Sorry, guys. Okay, that's just a personal thought. That's a good example of an annotation. I'm going to add that there. Hopefully you're adding these too. The preparations being complete, the two private soldiers stepped aside and each drew away the plank upon which he had been standing. The sergeant turned to the captain, saluted, and placed himself immediately behind that officer, who in turn moved apart one pace. These movements left the condemned man and the sergeant standing on the two ends of the same plank, which spanned 3 of the cross ties of the bridge. The end upon which the civilian stood almost but not quite reached a 4th. The plank had been held in place by the weight of the captain, and it was now held by that of the sergeant. At a signal from the former, the sergeant, the latter would step aside, the plank would tilt, and the condemned man would go down between 2 ties. So they're just explaining here, he's standing on this plank, there's a man standing on the other side. When that man steps off the plank, he'll fall and be hanged. So just lots of imagery there, which is really good. It's actually kind of interesting. The arrangement contented itself to his judgment as simple and effective. His face hadn't been covered, nor his eyes bandaged. He looked a moment at his unsteadfast footing, and then let his gaze wander to the swirling water of the stream racing madly beneath his feet. A piece of dancing driftwood caught his attention, and his eyes followed it down the current. How slowly it appeared to move. What a sluggish stream. So as he's about to be hanged, he's kind of looking around him at his surroundings in his final moments. Okay, he closed his eyes in order to fix his last thoughts upon his wife and children. The water, touched to gold by the early sun, the brooding mists under the banks at some distance down the stream, the fort, the soldiers, the piece of drift, all had distracted him. And now he became conscious of a new disturbance. Striking through the thought of his dear ones was a sound which he could neither ignore nor understand, a sharp, distinct, metallic percussion like the stroke of a blacksmith's hammer on the anvil. It had the same ringing quality. He wondered what it was and whether immeasurably distant or nearby. It seemed both. Its recurrence was regular, but as slow as the tolling of a death knell. So he's hearing this like regular, repeated, rhythmic sound. He awaited each new stroke with impatience, and he knew not why, but with apprehension. The intervals of silence grew progressively longer. The delays were maddening. With their greater infrequency, the sounds increased in strength and sharpness. They hurt his ear like the thrust of a knife. He feared he would shriek. What he heard was the ticking of his watch. Okay, so they said this word sharpness, and they spent this whole paragraph talking about this repetitive rhythmic sound he's hearing, and then in the last line, we realize that he's hearing his watch ticking. And so I'm going to add a note that I feel like, they say a lot of times this happens when someone is in a near-death experience or they're in like a very, very high stress situation, that their senses can be heightened. And I think that's what's happening.